Live look, Senate floor now, waiting final confirmation. The senators taking their turns. Democratic Senator from Hawaii still there at the lectern. Want to bring back our panel and welcome Josh Holmes, used to be Chief of Staff to Mitch McConnell. And Josh joined our discussion here along with Tom Dupree and Andy McCarthy, Marie Harf, Chris Direwall. Going to bring in Shannon Bream also in a moment here as well. Josh, why don't we start with you and just reflect on the lunch yesterday. Mitch McConnell goes to lunch with Susan Collins. That appeared to be on the outside as a moment of peace among the two.
Well, I think they've had peace all along. You know, I mean, I think one of McConnell's great gifts is listening to his members, and it's not just in the category of whipping votes. It's just kind of in totality. And he's had a great relationship with Senator Collins, and he knows darn well that she doesn't respond to bullying. This is not a senator who's ever responded well to people trying to push her around. And in fact, the one thing that she requires is more information. And any information that you've got to provide her. And I think that's evidenced in a speech that she ultimately gave yesterday. That is one of the most well-researched speeches that I've seen on the Senate floor in, my time, 15 plus years of being around. Really, really impressive. And I think just facilitating that information to her is something he really did well.
Josh, talk to us a little bit about how people who worked for Senator McConnell over the years say, do not underestimate him. And from him going, 2 years ago in October 2016, Trump supporters we can't stand that Mitch McConnell. And now they look at Mitch McConnell as somebody who was able to get this across the finish line, in addition to 26 other judges so far.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, politics is a little bit of a roller coaster, right? There's ups and there's downs, but Mitch McConnell's always just been a bulldozer. I mean, he just plows absolutely through every difficult situation, makes sure that he's discussing with members what it is that their concerns are, and sets a process in place that gets you to the best possible situation to get a good outcome in the end. And that's what we've seen here. You saw a lot of opportunity for people to cut and run when the political going got very tough. But I think he knew, based on the evidence and based on the discussions with Judge Kavanaugh, that he felt very good about this nominee, and his members ultimately would too once they had the opportunity to review all the material.
Yeah. Dana, I know you like this line. This is from Fatima Goss-Gray, as president of the National Women's Law Center. Here is the comment. This is a career-defining speech for Collins, not just in 2020, but it will be a core piece of her legacy.
Absolutely.
And you think about the way Chuck Grassley mentioned the senator from Maine from the 1950s, and he almost challenged Susan Collins to rise to that same level. Remember the Carthy era in the 1950s, how that senator from Maine shut down the operation, and in a very similar way that Senator Collins did yesterday afternoon by finally putting this process forward. Now, to Tom Dupree and Andy McCarthy, when you think about the balance of power in the Supreme Court, you think about the hearing on behalf of Judge Kavanaugh, Tom, and you think about the cases that he specifically mentioned in the speech that he prepared about executive power, and which cases he believes, based on history, were the most precedent-setting. And Susan Collins referenced those cases yesterday. It gives us a glimpse, I think, a little bit, Tom, into what can possibly be expected when he sits.
Look, I was fascinated, frankly, when Senator Collins got in and actually started citing specific cases that Judge Kavanaugh had referred to during his testimony. One of the criticisms we've heard about Judge Kavanaugh in this process is that he might be willing to give a blank check to the executive. And I think in his testimony, and when he cited the Supreme Court cases that have most resonated with him over his time on the bench, many of them did concern the judiciary's critical check on executive power and ensuring that we have separation of powers, a balanced government. And so I think that Judge Kavanaugh presented his constitutional thinking as far more nuanced and thoughtful than many of the caricatures that we've seen out there.
Andy McCarthy, I wanted to ask you about what are the big major issues, the big buckets of issues that this Supreme Court Justice, Brett Kavanaugh, should be confirmed in about an hour and 10 minutes. What do you think will be the big issues that will be the ones he has to tackle first?
Well, I think two, Dana, are very important, and he talked at length about both of them in his confirmation hearings. One is privacy and the continuing clash that we have between the values of the Fourth Amendment and the changes in technology, the needs of national security, and where we strike the balance there. The other one I think that's very important, and I think has been misstated a great deal, is this business about what happens if some issue regarding President Trump were to come before the court. And I think his position is that if the president is to get protection, that has to come from Congress. the court is not in a position to exempt the president from civil or criminal proceedings.
Right. All right. Very fascinating. Of course, there's going to be a lot of issues, Bill.
Yeah. Stand by to all of you. Got a great panel here. They're not going anywhere. This is Patrick Leahy, now on the floor of the Senate, the Democrat from Vermont. So as they continue to take turns right and left, we will eventually make our way toward that hour, which right now appears to be 3:30, 3:45 East Coast time. Back in a moment right after this. Leahy on the floor, member of the Judiciary Committee, lacing into Brett Kavanaugh, even at the, well, what could be the final hour or the penultimate hour as we get closer and closer to a vote. Democrats still on the floor here, Republicans as well, as they take turns alternating for the past 28 hours, coming up on hour 30.
They're working on 30 hours. Penultimate, that's a great word, by the way. Love that word. Just about 90 minutes away from the final confirmation vote on Brett Kavanaugh. Let's go to Shannon Bream. She's anchor of Fox News at night. She's also a Supreme Court expert. You've been there from the very beginning, Shannon. As this wraps up, I wanted to get your just overall thoughts.
Yeah, I think back to the beginning of September when we went through the initial hearings we thought would be the only week of hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh. And I think about the things we talked about with him then. The first time he was nominated to the court where he sits now, he was first nominated in 2003. There was a lot of finagling and shenanigans. And, you know, until 2006, he didn't make it onto the bench. This guy's a marathon runner. He's done 2 big marathons. And I think that that is kind of a look at what he's been through this process. I don't think they ever thought that they would go to these places they've been in the last couple of weeks. But he has long been one of those guys who said, it doesn't matter what happens to me during this process. I'm not going anywhere. And all of us, I think, have had moments looking at him, looking at his family, his daughters, his wife, and thought, maybe this is enough. Maybe for them, they say, we don't go another step further in this. And with all the delays and the add-ons to the time, he has been somebody who said, I'm going to stay the course and no one's going to run me out of this. So he's had to run a marathon, and maybe today, Dana, it ends.
And I know you take over for us in just about an hour, Shannon, with Mitch McConnell at the top of the hour.
See you then.
All right.
Thank you, Shannon. We're waiting confirmation. We believe the vote now set to happen about 90 minutes from now. Protests building on the steps of the Capitol. Full coverage continues right here on Fox. Top of the hour.
Senate for weeks, and as you just heard from the majority leader, Republican leadership didn't know for sure it had the votes until a major speech from Maine's Susan Collins.
We've heard a lot of charges and countercharges about Judge Kavanaugh. But as those who have known him best have attested, he has been an exemplary public servant, judge, teacher, coach, husband, and father.
Some of Kavanaugh's critics expressed concerns about the judge's response in last week's very emotional hearing, where he was forced to defend his name and his integrity against some serious allegations. The one Republican opposing his nomination says she found his fiery response to be too much.
Even in these situations, the standard is that a judge must act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence.
Other Republicans suggest this fight is just what the base needs. 31 days from the midterm election, suggesting it could have a major impact in those races. Dana?
And Mike, tell me about the Democrats, because this vote looks like it's assured, but how do they plan to keep fighting?
Well, they are clearly recognizing that their base is fired up about the Kavanaugh nomination. So the speeches have continued around the clock, and you had New York Democrat Kirsten Gillibrand complaining about this confirmation process.
I deeply feel that the process over these last few months have turned our back on that basic desire to bring our country to more perfect union, to a place where we value one another. Do we value women? Unfortunately, for too many in this chamber, the answer is no.
Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley was critical of the nominee himself, Judge Kavanaugh.
We have before us a nominee who has been deceptive and misleading to this chamber time after time after time. They all come down to here's what he said and here's the truth.
Lawmakers taking their time to be on the record ahead of this historic vote in the United States Senate. Dana?
All right, Mike Manuel, thank you very much.
Meanwhile, President Trump, showing his support for pro-Kavanaugh protesters, tweeted this a bit earlier today, quote, "Women for Kavanaugh and many others who support this very good man are gathering all over Capitol Hill in preparation for a 3 to 5 p.m. vote. It is a beautiful thing to see, and they are not paid professional protesters who are handed expensive signs. Big day for America," end tweet. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts on the North Lawn now to pick it up from there. Hey, John.
Bill, good afternoon to you. The president will be leaving for Topeka, Kansas within the hour, so we may get a chance to throw some questions at him as he's on his way on the South Lawn now to Marine One. He has been in the residence all day today so far, but his White House confirmation team for Judge Kavanaugh has been working the phones, getting in touch with senators, making sure that everything is as it was yesterday and will continue to be going forward this afternoon. The First Lady Melania Trump in Egypt in the meantime as part of her trip to Africa, weighing in on Judge Kavanaugh and the process that we've seen over the past couple of weeks. Listen here.
I think he's highly qualified for the Supreme Court. I'm glad that Dr. Ford was heard. I'm glad that Judge Kavanaugh was heard. FBI investigation was done, is completed, and Senate voted.
The White House expects that the vote will be 50 to 48, with Lisa Murkowski of Alaska just voting president as opposed to voting no. We will definitely hear from the president later on this afternoon, whether it's aboard Air Force One or whether it's when he lands in Topeka, or maybe it's not until that rally. But the rally's not until 7:30 tonight Eastern time. So I think it's likely that the president might have something to say either on board the aircraft or as soon as he lands.
But we wait that. What about the political fallout from all this, John? What are you hearing and what are they saying?
I mean, the gap between Democrats, who had the advantage, and Republicans has been narrowing all the way along here. But the White House believes that the way that all of this unfolded has energized Republican voters in a way that they weren't before the midterm elections. And according to Mercedes Schlapp, who was on Fox and Friends this morning, Republicans aren't going to forget this for a long time to come. Listen here.
I will tell you, it's going to be very hard to forget what some of these Democrats have done from the beginning, where they made it their priority to resist, to ensure that this man would not make it to the court. And the way they did it in trying to destroy his reputation is completely uncalled for.
Now, the president was determined to stand behind Kavanaugh because to withdraw the nomination, particularly this close to the midterm elections, could have been devastating. It's unclear what Kavanaugh's confirmation or what effect Kavanaugh's confirmation will have on the midterms. I think if he were defeated in a Senate vote, you would probably see a lot of energy on the Republican side. You know, Bill, when you win, sometimes the enthusiasm goes down. When you lose, the enthusiasm to not repeat a loss goes up. But I think unclear how this is going to affect voting just about a month from today. But I think one thing is clear, that even when Judge Kavanaugh gets confirmed this afternoon as expected and then is sworn in next week, this will not be the end of it.
Yeah.
Bill?
Agree on that. Thank you, John. Be back with you momentarily from the White House. John Roberts there. Thank you, Dana.
All right. In the meantime, let's go to our panel. Andy McCarthy, he's a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Marie Harf is the co-host of Benson and Harf. Chris Stirewalt is a Fox News politics editor. And Tom Dupree is a former deputy assistant attorney general. Of course, we have Shannon Bream as well. She's the anchor of Fox News at night and an essential person for all of this coverage. Chris Stirewalt, could I go to you, please? There in Washington, D.C., the Washington Post doing something it has not done in 30 years, writing, unfortunately and unnecessarily, it didn't have to be this way. Too many questions remain about his history for senators to responsibly vote yes. At the same time, enough has been learned about his partisan instincts that we believe senators must vote no. So the Washington Post editorial board, for the first time in 30 years, calling on the Senate to vote no on a nominee. Your thoughts on that?
And that's why Kavanaugh took the highly unusual step of writing that op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week to say, hey, look, you said things, I said things, and I'm sorry about the way it turned out, but I promise when I'm on the court, I'm going to act like I did in the 12 years that I was on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And I'm going to be collegial, and I'm going to be impartial, and I'm going to respect the rule of law and all of those things. But I will tell you this. in this era of the nuclear winter, now that both sides have employed the nuclear option for presidential appointments, and we are in this majoritarian phase in the Senate, this is going to get worse like this. And it will get more tribal, and it will get more partisan. And Tom and others today have said it, and they're 100% right. The esteem and value in which we place the Supreme Court, our most important small r Republican institution, will be damaged by fights like these, and they will keep coming as long as it's just a question of who can get 50+1.
Shannon Bream, could I ask you about that? I know that you revere the Supreme Court. You've studied the Supreme Court, you've covered it for a long time. What do you think of that and this suggestion that the integrity of the court has now been eroded?
We know there are those who think that that's actually what this is all about. That the fight from the left is to suggest that this is not a legitimate president, and now this is not going to be a legitimate court because of the man that he has selected to place on the court. We've talked a lot with Georgetown professor Randy Barnett, who has made, he's written about this and talked about this and said that it is the left's way of delegitimizing the court, so that whatever Justice Kavanaugh, if he becomes a justice, whatever he decides, there'll be an asterisk not only next to him, but next to the decisions that come from the court. So he sees it, and others on the right see it as a potential chipping away at the institution of the court itself by delegitimizing this man who's being named to the court. But we all have to remember that Justice Thomas went through this 26 years ago, and he's taken his time on the court very seriously. We know he is not somebody who does a lot of talking from the bench, and he prefers to let his decisions and his opinions do the talking for him.
Shannon, on that,
and he spent that time.
Was that born out of the debate of 25 years ago? Why has Clarence Thomas taken that posture?
I think he feels like a lot of what he said over the years has been misconstrued. And instead of having his words taken out of context for him, I think there was a point at which he decided about 10 years ago that he would rather let his opinions do the talking for themselves. You do see him speak outside of the court, and he's very free-flowing in some of the speeches that he gives outside the court, and that's kind of where he puts down his stake and makes his personality known. And he's got a big personality, but he's chosen to not let it interfere with his work on the court, with his what he's doing there by becoming the story instead of maybe the case that's being covered that day. He knows anything that he says is going to be parsed and picked apart. And I think he got tired of being criticized for trying to do his job there because it was constantly drawn back to the way he got to the court. So he's let his work speak for itself. And some of his speeches outside of it are pretty entertaining.
Tom, you've studied this as well. What is your sense of that over the past 25 years when you reflect on that?
Well, if you look back the last 25 years, yeah, Justice Thomas, as Shannon correctly noted, he doesn't ask a lot of questions from the bench. And one thing he said is that in his view, the Supreme Court is there to hear argument from the lawyers, to hear them present the arguments and the evidence, rather than to allow the justices to have effectively a conversation with one another. So I think from Justice Thomas's perspective, a lot of it is what Shannon was saying, and I think a lot of it is he views oral argument as a chance for the lawyers to make their case to the bench. I've had the privilege of arguing in front of the Supreme Court, and I can assure you he pays rapt attention to what you say, and as Shannon correctly noted, he does speak through his decisions, and he is a wonderful, jovial man outside the court as well.
Andy McCarthy, could I ask you about the Founding Fathers and their thinking behind the Supreme Court, a limited court with lifetime appointments to make decisions based, as you've said, do we have too much importance on the Supreme Court at this point?
Yeah, I think we do, Dana, and I think listening to my colleagues address this, we have to do, I think, the hardest thing to do, which is kind of step out of the present moment. What we're seeing today is actually a trajectory that the Supreme Court has been on for a long time. It didn't just get political 3 weeks ago. This is, in many ways, just a culmination of trends that have been ongoing for some time. But the silver lining, if there is one, is that when we evaluate Brett Kavanaugh 10 years out, 15 years out, it's not going to be about what's happening today, as noisy and as harsh as this has all been. It will be in the context of these very important decisions that come before the Supreme Court and that have to be decided. And I think once we get past that, that's really what this will be all about. It won't be about this controversy anymore. It will be about the cases that get resolved on the court.
To all of you, stand by. It's 13 minutes past the hour, 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon. We expect to vote about 90 minutes from now. That's what we think so far. Our producers
92 even.
Capitol as we count down literally by the moment. All this coming now days after the FBI wrapped up yet another investigation, number 7 of Judge Kavanaugh, prompted by Jeff Flake's 11th hour agreement. That was 9 days ago. So we're moving toward that moment. More analysis ahead as the clock ticks down to a critical and historical vote.
Look at me when I'm talking to you. You're telling me that my assault doesn't matter, that what happened to me doesn't matter, and that you're going to let people who do these things into power. That's what you're telling me when you vote for him.
I would be only comfortable moving forward on the floor. I'll move it out of committee, but I will only be comfortable moving on the floor until the FBI has done more investigation than they have already. It may not take them a week. I understand that some of these witnesses may not want to discuss anything further, but I think we owe them due diligence.
It was an unforgettable moment. Jeff Flake throwing the brakes on this process last Friday afternoon, forcing that 1 week delay before a full Senate vote that should be in the offing about 90 minutes from now. 7th FBI investigation conducted into Brett Kavanaugh's life over the past week or so, and now the Senate on the cusp of perhaps confirming the judge to the highest court in the land. Louisiana Republican John Kennedy was on the Judiciary Committee. And Senator, we have spoken a lot over the past couple of weeks, and good afternoon to you today, and thank you for coming back. Where do you think we are in this now, Senator?
I just left the Senate floor. Many of my Democratic friends continue to speak a message of fear to the American people. They continue to make wild accusations about Judge Kavanaugh. He's evil. He hates women. He hates children. He hates little warm puppies. For me, today is a day of hope. I think we're going to approve the appointment of a new Supreme Court justice who understands the role of the United States Supreme Court and our Madisonian separation of powers.
I watched you on another network just yesterday, Senator, and you said nobody wins in this. You say Judge Kavanaugh loses and Dr. Ford loses?
In terms of the confirmation process, there won't be any winners. There could have been. There could have been winners on both sides if we had a confirmation process that was senatorial and that it was orderly and that was dignified, that was tough. There's nothing wrong with having a tough process, asking tough questions. But this process was untracked when Senator Feinstein decided to sit on Dr. Ford's letter. But that still doesn't mean we can't be thankful. I'm going to vote happily and proudly for Judge Kavanaugh, and I am hopeful. I think he understands that the role of the Supreme Court justice is not to try to rewrite the Constitution every other Thursday to advance a political agenda. It's to be an umpire, to say what the law is and not what the law ought to be. And that's what I'm going to celebrate today.
Yeah. Why do you think Judge Gorsuch went through so easily and this one did not?
I don't think it had anything to do with Justice Gorsuch versus soon-to-be Justice Kavanaugh.
Was it numbers?
I think it was the fact that Justice Kennedy was considered to be a swing vote. I think that the opposition to Judge Kavanaugh looked at his record, saw that it was a distinguished one, so they decided that the only way to take him down is through character assassination. And I really regret that, but that's what happened. That's why I said yesterday, and I'll say again today, there are no winners. I'll bet you if you talk to Judge Kavanaugh or Dr. Ford tonight, neither one of them think they won.
Could you imagine if he was defeated based on words and accusation from 36 years ago?
Well, one other positive, though, this in addition to being proud that we're going to confirm Judge Kavanaugh, I'm proud that we reaffirmed the importance of due process in our society. That doesn't mean that we don't have a problem with sexual violence in America. We clearly do. But and I'll say it again. This is no country for creepy old men or middle-aged men or young men. But it's not a country at all without due process. And you have to treat both the accused and the accuser, both of them, with respect and fairness and due process. That's the kind of country I want to live in.
Senator Kennedy, it's Dana Perino. I wanted to ask you about, last Sunday night you appeared on 60 Minutes. This was right after Senator Jeff Flake on a Friday, just a week ago yesterday, asked for that supplemental FBI investigation. Some Republicans were kind of frustrated about that and the delay. But looking back in hindsight, do you think that that actually was something that actually helped a lot of senators be able to get to yes, such as a Susan Collins?
Yes, it clearly helped. And Senator Flake and Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski, at the time, it was clear to me that they probably weren't going to vote for confirmation without the additional FBI investigation. I didn't think it was necessary from a substance point of view, because I felt like our investigators at the Judiciary Committee had done a great job. And indeed, the FBI report just, for the most part, reaffirmed what our judiciary investigators found. But it was important to Senator Flake and Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski, and in hindsight, I'm glad we did it.
It doesn't appear that
American people.
If you listen to her speech from yesterday, Senator, it doesn't appear that Senator Collins needed that separate FBI investigation.
Oh,
I mean, the way she laid out the case.
I think she did. I spent a lot of time down in our secure quarters reading the FBI background investigation, and I saw Senator Collins every time I was there. She spent a lot of time going over it. Susan does her homework.
Yeah, that wasn't my suggestion. My suggestion was that the argument that she was making public yesterday seemed like she was a yes for a long time.
Maybe. I mean, I couldn't read Susan. Susan is, and it's not my place to read her. Her vote is her own. But my experience with Senator Collins is she's extremely conscientious, and she always looks at both sides. And she does almost an exhaustive investigation on an issue. And my impression was, I don't know what was in her mind or in her heart, but my impression was that she was undecided.
Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. John Kennedy, Senator from Louisiana. Thank you.
All right, it's just a little over an hour from now. The Senate will vote on the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. This coming after several fence sitters swung in the judge's direction. Our live coverage continues with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He will speak with Chris Wallace and Shannon Bream at 3 p.m. Eastern right here on the Fox News Channel.
I didn't know whether we'd ever get to this point, but I'm very glad we do. But I think the most important thing is to think about what it says about the background of Judge Kavanaugh, a person who has been very well educated, very well devoted to public service, but more importantly, 12 years on the second most important court in our land.
That's Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley earlier today, as we are getting closer to the final vote on the confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. This is expected to take place exactly 1 hour from now. The Senate expected to vote in favor of Kavanaugh after a contentious and highly emotional confirmation battle. Joining me now, Tennessee Senator Bob Corker. Sir, this might be one of the most important votes that you take as a senator, but it also could be one of the last ones that you take as you are retiring. And I wonder what your thoughts are today as you have a historic day, over a weekend, right up to the deadline, with all of the midterms looming and then the 2020 election beyond it. I mean, this is some pretty high stakes.
Well, Dan, it is, and I'm very confident in my vote. I'm looking forward to it. I talked to Judge Kavanaugh this morning and thanked him for his willingness to serve the country in this manner and to go through all this, and talked to Don McGahn, who's, I think, going to leave the White House whenever he leaves with a tremendous legacy for our country. Talked to Susan Collins yesterday and thanked her for a speech that to me was historic and not only reflected well on all Republicans, but I think the Senate as a whole. And so, yes, it's a big day. It's a great day for our nation. And I look forward to the vote at 3:30 or 4, whenever it takes place.
Wondering what you think about the partnership between President Trump and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell when it comes to judges. They've been working in concert together. They have a record number of judges confirmed already. This would make the second Supreme Court justice. And how have you seen that play out over the past couple of years?
Well, Senator McConnell makes no bones about the fact that this will be, in some ways, transformative. This is going to be, as you know, better than most. I mean, this is going to impact our country for more than a generation. We're still going to confirm more judges after this throughout the duration of this year. Still have a lot of work to do in that regard. But look, this is a legacy that the president and our majority leader can be very proud of, and they've worked very well together. And let's face it, Mitch has been dogged in his approach. He just keeps pressing on, doesn't get distracted, and he's done an outstanding job with this. He really has.
Senator, I was picking up on a couple of things you said this past week, but before I get there, what was Brett Kavanaugh's state of mind this morning when you spoke with him?
You know, he was very upbeat. He was very upbeat. I can't imagine the life that he has lived over the last couple of weeks, and just the horror of being accused of something like this, coming before the tenor that he's had to take, if you will, from on the other side of the aisle in both of the hearings. But it's been very difficult, very upbeat. Bill, I told him I was very envious. I've lived a pretty full life and met many people in my life. But I think it spoke volumes about who he is to see how many friends, close friends that he has who've come out on his behalf, people that have known him all of his life. And I told him, obviously, in a somewhat joking way, I was envious of him and having so many close friends who supported and loved him the way they do.
Now, did he express what he shared in the Wall Street Journal piece the other night about being too emotional at a point during that hearing 10 days ago?
No, you know, I read that, obviously. But, you know, I think at this point he knows what the outcome is going to be, and I think he's focused on the future and committed, after all that's happened, to being the very best Supreme Court justice that he can possibly be. And I think he's going to double down on that. And I think his colleagues will embrace him well when he gets there, just because of the kind of person that he is.
Did you get a chance to speak to his wife, Ashley, or find out about how
I did
she
not.
and the daughters are doing?
I did not, but I certainly asked him about that and shared my I don't know, my empathy for all that they have dealt with.
Sir, as you prepare to retire from the Congress and you look at how important the Supreme Court nominations have become for both Republicans and Democrats, for all Americans, what do you think about Congress's role here and the need to sort of reassert itself as a legislative body, passing laws and not relying on the court to make law?
Well, Dana, you know, you're hitting the nail on the head as to why there's so many protests and why, you know, this ends up being such an emotional battle, because we are not doing our job. So many of the things that the Supreme Court has to resolve are things that we should be passing legislation with. And no matter how you may feel about the recent tariff issues, my concern was using the 232 tariff issue, which really is Congress's role, the Section 232 of the 74 Trade Act. Again, it's just a continual situation of Congress, you know, not really stepping up or giving away some of its responsibilities. So you're exactly right. I mean, if Congress would resolve these big issues for our nation, as Congress is supposed to do, these Supreme Court nominations and battles would not be emotional at all.
Thanks, sir.
Senator, we're going to move to another guest, but I just want to quote you from Tuesday night, because this is where you came out publicly and said you were a yes, essentially. Those who were sympathetic to Dr. Ford could not recall or provide any evidence to support her story. Did you make that argument to other senators who might have been on the fence or not?
I did. We had some discussions down in the SCIF as we were all reading this. And then let me just say one other thing, Bill. Women have suffered injustices for decades. We all know that. And our heart goes out to them for that. But to project those injustices that have happened to them onto an individual like Judge Kavanaugh that have absolutely nothing to do with that is also an injustice. And I really do think that the other side of the aisle, unfortunately, just over-leveraged this. They overreached, and I think the American people have seen that. And again, I look forward to today. As Dana was alluding to, these are emotional. Congress should step up and pass laws itself. Hopefully that will happen, but it's been the greatest privilege of my life, regardless of how we function, to serve in this body, and I thank you and others for how they've treated me. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Bob Corker, the Republican from Tennessee. Thank you for being here with us today. Back live on the floor now, the Senate. Give you an idea about what's happening down there. We think, Dana, we're about an hour away.
Yeah,
Just
less
about
than.
that. Greg Nunziata is a former chief nominations counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was involved in at least 2 nomination processes. And Greg, welcome back here. Senator Cornyn there on the floor, the Republican from Texas. What do you think about the point that Bob Corker was making there at the end about Democrats overplaying their hand, Greg?
No, I think that's exactly right in a lot of ways. I mean, they clearly were going to be against whoever the president nominated. They said as much. They tried to stop the hearings from even starting. Once these allegations surfaced, which they had hid and mishandled, they immediately convicted Judge Kavanaugh based on no evidence, threw the presumption of innocence out the window. And I think all that behavior really drew strong reactions and repelled Senator Collins, Senator Graham, and other folks who've been kind of moderates on judicial confirmation issues. It's also really galvanized American voters, Republican voters in particular. I've never seen the Republicans so united and so energized over the last several years. So there are obviously bigger issues at stake, individual lives and the Supreme Court, but the impact on the election, I think, will be felt.
Greg, it's Dana. I wanted to ask you about some unanswered questions, or basically some things that people still think are a mystery, like who leaked Dr. Ford's letter? Where were the therapist notes? All of these things that, the left thinks that the FBI investigation was incomplete, but the right thinks that the committee still has some work to do. Do you think that the committee will endeavor to try to get answers to those things, or let it go and try to move forward?
I think a lot of people would like to close the door on the ugliness of the last few weeks. I don't think they're going to be able to. These are really big questions. I mean, the way these allegations came into at least Senator Feinstein's office, and that they weren't followed up upon, they weren't put through the normal procedures of the Judiciary Committee, and then came out in what seemed like a coordinated political hit, just totally blows up the traditions of the committee. And, this isn't just, they don't just do this for Supreme Court nominations. That committee processes hundreds of nominations to all sorts of judgeships and other important positions. That process has to work. And if it didn't work here, we need to know why and how things went wrong, and if it could be improved in the future.
That's Dick Durbin from Illinois now, the Democrat there on Judiciary Committee as well. Greg, when you think about all the arguments that have been made about Brett Kavanaugh's testimony and the assertive way that he addressed the senators, well, how do you address temperament? How do you judge a judge's temperament?
Well, I think it's look, I've worked on the confirmation process of dozens and dozens of judges. I know lots of judges personally. Some of them are moody, some are prickly, some get angry in traffic. That's all okay. It has nothing to do with judicial temperament. Judicial temperament is how you comport yourself as a judge. And Judge Kavanaugh has a tremendous reputation for an exceedingly professional judicial temperament in this town. In that hearing room last week, he wasn't functioning as a judge. He was functioning effectively as a defendant in a show trial. I think it was entirely just and appropriate for him to get angry and for him to push back a little bit. In fact, I think at the end of the day, him being real and not being scripted and working off talking points, I think that turned his confirmation around.
Greg, thank you. Greg Nunziata there from Washington, D.C. Nice to see you, Greg.
Good to have him, right? Like a good guest who knows what he's talking about. He's been there. All right, as the Senate prepares for its final vote, we're keeping an eye right there on the Senate floor, and protests also on Capitol Hill. We'll have more analysis with Karl Rove up ahead.
The Capitol.
2:44, Washington, D.C. We believe a vote could happen in about 46 minutes from now. Dick Durbin, screen left, protesters screen right. Live look outside the Capitol where the protesters are making their voices heard in these closing moments. Inside on the Senate floor, senators now wrapping up debate, about a 30-hour stretch before a final confirmation vote comes on Brett Kavanaugh. Back with us, Karl Rove, former senior advisor, Deputy Chief of Staff for President George W. Bush. And Karl, as we wait here, you're listening to speeches on the floor. They're taking turns. Sometimes they alternate, sometimes they do not. What are you picking up in terms of themes that you're hearing there now in these closing moments?
I'm interested how stale the Democrats are. They are recycling arguments and accusations and allegations that they raised in the course of the two hearings and during the two hearings, and many of which are completely baseless. May I give you two examples?
Sure.
Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts says, Kavanaugh, if he's on the court, has already indicated that he will not allow Donald Trump to be civilly or criminally charged or investigated or during his time in office. That's not what Kavanaugh said at all. As Andy McCarthy pointed out earlier, he once made a speech in which he said the investigations are criminal and civil investigations are a huge drain of time on a president, but it was up to Congress to decide whether or not a president could be charged, investigated, charged with a crime while he was in office. That was up to Congress, he said, not the courts deliberately. And yet Markey goes out and makes that accusation. Senator Leahy goes out there and once again calls Brett a liar for having not told the truth about being involved in the nomination of Bill Pryor to the Atlanta Circuit Court, and saying that he lied to the committee. I know that's absolutely untrue. I'm the guy who was pushing for Bill Pryor to be put on the 11th Circuit, and Ben Powell was the White House counsel who worked on that, not Brett. And yet, once again, Leahy goes down and on the floor of the United States Senate calls Brett a liar on that subject and several others, when he is absolutely, totally wrong. It's amazing to me that they are so sloppy and so callous in their comments.
Ed Markey's the one at the rally outside.
Right. So he
had a picture of there.
Right. So he took exactly what he said on the Senate floor, and then he took it out to the protesters out there as well. Karl, let me ask you, just like looking ahead to the next several hours. President Trump's at the White House. He's going to be leaving for Kansas in just a little bit to go to a rally there. He leaves today with a second Supreme Court confirmation. That's a significant accomplishment, another promise kept. Tell me about the president's standing now going into the midterms in 2020.
Well, it'll be strong. It'll be even stronger. It will be better than it was several weeks ago when he looked like he was going to be defeated on this. Success begets success. It's why we've seen in the last couple of weeks a modest increase in the president's polls. The higher he gets on the favorable and unfavorable, the better for Republicans in the midterm elections, and the better for the president in whatever next policy battle he intends to engage on. So this has been very valuable for the president. He's had terrific assistance in the Senate. He's been aided, ironically, by events that were outside of his control. Nobody inside the White House, nobody in the Senate Republican leadership was enthusiastic about an additional FBI investigation, but it now turns out that made it comfortable for Jeff Flake to vote for Brett Kavanaugh, and it made Susan Collins able to vote for Brett Kavanaugh. And interestingly enough, as it was seen in the Harvard-Harris poll, it now it lays the groundwork for as much as 60% of the American people to believe that Kavanaugh should be confirmed, because the additional investigation found no corroborating evidence for the charges made against him.
Conversely, do you think Joe Manchin survives in November after his yes vote in a state where Trump won by 42 points 2 years ago?
Yeah, I do. I think it gives him a very high-profile action to point to say, when I think the president is right, I'm going to work with him, even when it makes me unpopular in my party. And I was the only Democrat to do so because I thought it was the right thing to do. And it's a powerful argument to be made coming down the stretch. On the other hand, Claire McCaskill in Missouri and Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota and John Tester in Montana and Joe Donnelly in Indiana are in graver difficulty today because of this.
All right, Karl Rove, we always appreciate having you. Stick around. After a months-long bruising battle over Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, senators preparing to vote on his confirmation just about